All right, welcome class. Hopefully all is well out there in your quarantine as you are hopefully keeping up with your schoolwork, doing all the things that our staff has put together for you. I know most of you are keeping up with your American history assignments. And so I hope to occasionally put out a video that will kind of explain what we're doing and just supplement, I guess, the best word to put it, the readings and the videos and the other things that's going on here. Obviously, we have other things at our disposal, and this is all new to us as we try to figure out ways to get the information to you and hopefully still educate you during this time period. So it's crazy times that we live in, and so hopefully we're providing what we can when we can. All right, so make sure you're keeping up with the readings and the videos and all those other things, the assignments as well. And so this week you were supposed to read about Jimmy Carter in 25:1 and Ronald Reagan in 25:2. And so today's video, I just want to kind of touch base about Jimmy Carter and a little bit about Reagan. And then we'll kind of continue that on next week. All right, so with Jimmy Carter, Jimmy Carter himself as a man was always deemed as being one of the truly honorable men to ever hold the office of president. It's just that as a president, he was not successful in a number of things that he attempted to do. His greatest achievement, we'll start with that, was the Camp David Accords. All right, so if you remember reading about the Camp David Accords, that was his ability to bring Egypt and Israel together in a way that nobody had really thought was possible. That the divide religiously between the Jewish Israelis and the Islamic nations like Egypt, the idea that they would have a peace treaty there after years and years of fighting was quite an achievement. And so, he worked hard for that. After 14 days, he was able to convince the two sides to come to an agreement. And so that was a great achievement by the Carter administration. But there were a number of issues that Carter did have to deal with. And the first thing, of course, economically, where Carter seemed to struggle, was with how to solve the issue of inflation, because we had double-digit inflation. All right, so like right now, just as an example, if you wanted to buy a home for 30 years, you could do that and have an interest rate of about 3%, maybe even lower given the situation right now. Back in the 70s, if you wanted to get a 30-year mortgage, you were going to pay 12 to 15% on that loan, which is going to be an extremely large amount of interest that you are paying, which means, of course, it's going to cost a lot more than the loan when it's all said and done. What this then means, of course, is that people won't take loans out. If they know they're going to have to pay a lot on the loan, that's not really an incentive to get a loan. So what they end up doing, of course, the American people, is they are not buying goods. They are not getting loans. They are not spending. And of course, this creates a lull in the economy. And the Carter administration seemed, inept at times as to how to deal with that inflation, with that oil issue, with the Middle East. And so that is an issue that Carter seemed to not be able to successfully resolve. All right. The other issue that he struggled with, of course, is what to do with Iran. And of course, this stems from the Shah of Iran being a good ally to the United States in the 60s and 70s. Iran was one of the most westernized nations in the world. I should say in the Middle East, I'm sorry. And what I mean by that is they had adopted many kind of European or American ideals as far as dress, music, even governance to a certain extent. And so they seem to be a good ally of ours in the Middle East and kind of a hedge to Russian influence or Soviet influence in that region. And then the Ayatollah Khomeini comes to power. They oust the Shah, and we, being allies of the Shah, allowed him to come to the United States. He had been ill, and we allowed him to come to the United States for medical help. This was much against the Iranian wishes. After he had been ousted, they didn't want anybody to take him in. And in doing so, this kind of inflames anti-American sentiment in Iran, which then results in the attack on the U.S. Embassy. And when the embassy was attacked, of course, 55 American hostages will be taken. And the Carter administration didn't seem to be able to get them released. They tried to negotiate that. That wasn't working. Carter tried a military option where he sent helicopters into Iran, or attempted to free the hostages. And of course, that ended in tragedy when one of the helicopters crashed, killing 8 service members. And so even when Carter tried to act decisively, it didn't work out, and of course it ended tragically in that situation. And so, his inability to deal effectively with Iran and get the hostages released really affects the 1980 presidential election. The Republicans nominate Ronald Reagan, who had made he almost was able to take the nomination away from Ford in 1976. Not quite able to do that, but then in 1980, he is nominated by the Republicans. And of course, he runs a very strong campaign, and in the end is able to defeat Jimmy Carter using the issues of the economy and communism, as well as the Iran hostage situation, as examples of Carter's inability to lead. Carter then, in the interim, after losing the election in November, he has the November, December, and January that he is still president of the United States, and he works to try to negotiate to get those hostages released, but to no avail. Iran is just simply not going to release them. And then Ronald Reagan's inaugurated in January, and within minutes of his oath of office, Iran announces that they will release the hostages. They just were not going to allow Carter that foreign policy victory of having them released. And so Reagan, he's president for all of 5-10 minutes, and he already has a foreign policy victory. Nothing he did specifically, but it definitely, was because Carter wasn't the president anymore. So after 444 days, the American hostages are coming home. And so that makes America feel pretty good about that. Economically, we talk about Reaganomics, which was the idea of Ronald Reagan's ideas of the economy. And the idea was we need greater supply. Supply-side economics is what it's going to be called, with the idea of trickle-down economics. All right, so the idea is you help at the top, you create more product, you help those businesses, and of course that gain will then trickle down to the workers and to the common individual as well. You don't help the bottom necessarily and hope that it rises to the top. You help the top and hope that it comes down to the bottom. So occasionally I will get a notification on my screen. I hope that doesn't make it blurry like it just did when I was doing it. Anyway, so trickle-down economics is kind of the Reaganomic idea, and it does work. It has a dip in 1982 as we get a recession again, but by 83-84 we see the economy really beginning to take off. And so in the election of 1984, when Reagan is running for re-election, he has a strong economy to run on. Walter Mondale, the Democratic nominee, chose Geraldine Ferraro, the first woman to be on the ticket for a major party. So that was a pretty substantial thing that happened there in the 1984 election. But it wasn't enough to turn people to be really interested in what Mondale was kind of talking about and what he was campaigning on. That Reagan was a very likable person. Reagan had been a former actor in Hollywood in the 1940s. But then he got into politics in the 50s and 60s and became governor of California, and then eventually, of course, president. But because of his acting career, he knew how to be in front of a camera. He knew how to kind of address people and really kind of put people at ease. And people felt comfortable with Reagan. And he wins in a landslide in 1984. I mean, it's not even close. Like, Mondale won his one state of, I want to say Minnesota, and that was it. Reagan won everything else. We look at the Reagan presidency, and it almost was ended right out of the gate there in 1981 when, after he had taken the oath of office, a couple months in, a man by the name of John Hinckley Jr. Attempted to assassinate Reagan and actually came pretty close to succeeding. Reagan did take a shrapnel of a bullet. It had kind of ricocheted off a door and into his side and lodged within an inch, a little less than an inch from his heart. Had it gotten to his heart, of course, he would have died pretty instantly. But he was able to get to a hospital. doctors were able to operate and remove that bullet from him, and so he was able to have his 8 years as president, even though Hinckley had attempted to assassinate him. But one thing that biographers and others say about Reagan is that really did affect him in his foreign policy approach. The idea of that he was here to do a much bigger thing in regards to the Cold War, and that he begins to take a much kind of forceful approach to dealing with the Soviet Union and the issues of nuclear proliferation and, of course, Cold War issues. He begins to refer to the Soviet Union as an evil empire, and really kind of antagonizing, you will, the Soviets. And some were against this idea that, you don't want to antagonize people with nuclear weapons. But Reagan was pretty assuredly, he was painting the picture, basically, of this idea that they were the evil in the world who restrict freedoms and prevent people from living lives that they want, while we were the good in the world who attempted to make sure that people could live the lives that they want. And so Reagan is really going to kind of paint that spectrum, if you will, in regards to the Cold War issues. The problem with negotiating with the Soviet Union was that they just didn't have leaders that lasted long enough to truly negotiate with him. They went through a number of premiers as they were kind of older, hardline communists, but they just didn't last very long. They died before they could really negotiate with Reagan until 1985, when they chose Mikhail Gorbachev. And with Gorbachev becoming the new premier, we begin to see a change in the negotiations between Reagan and Gorbachev, the United States and the Soviet Union, in regards to nuclear weapons, and of course the alleviating of those tensions in the Cold War. But short of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the Cold War 1980s was probably the highest of tensions, as you have all sorts of kind of fear, if you will, of this proliferation of nuclear tensions, and that the idea that World War III was an inevitability, that this was just going to happen at some point, because how else is this going to resolve itself? And there was this sense of dread, if you will. And so Reagan is working through that, and of course dealing with Mikhail Gorbachev. So next week, what we'll do is we'll kind of pick this up with the Reagan foreign policy, and how his ideas, as well as his negotiations with the Soviet Union, will eventually lead to the end of this Cold War era and usher in a new era, beginning with George H.W. Bush. And of course, we'll begin looking at his presidency and the effect that it will have as well. So I hope all is well out there. I hope you guys are staying healthy. And gosh, I look forward to the next time we can actually communicate in person. All right. So until next time.